I remonstrated warmly against such notions. Poets and philosophers had said that it was a spectacle worthy of the divinity to see men struggling with fortune, reverses, and constancy had their glory. Such a great and noble character as his could not descend to the level of vulgar minds. He who had governed us with so much glory, who had excited the admiration and influenced the destinies of the world, could not end like a desperate gamester or a disappointed lover. What would then become of all those who looked up to and placed their hopes in him? Would he thus abandon the field to his enemies? The anxiety shown by the latter to drive him to it was surely sufficient to make him resist. Who besides could tell the secrets of time, or dare assert what the future would produce? What might not happen from the mere change of a ministry, the death of a prince, that of a confidant, the slightest passion, or the most trifling dispute? Some of these suggestions have their weight, said the emperor. But what can we do in that desolate place? Sire, I replied, we will live in the past. There is enough in it to satisfy us. Do we not enjoy the life of Caesar and that of Alexander? We shall possess still more. You will peruse yourself, sire. Be it so, rejoined Napoleon. We will write our memoirs. Yes, we must be employed, for occupation is the scythe of time. After all, a man ought to fulfill his destinies. This was my grand doctrine. Let mine also be accomplished. Reassuming from this instant an air of ease and even gaiety, he passed on to subjects totally unconnected with our situation. The fourth. Orders had arrived during the night for us to sail at an early hour. We set sail, which circumstance puzzled us much. The newspapers, official communications, and private conversations told us we were to be conveyed to St. Helena by the Northumberland. We knew that this ship was still fitting out at Portsmouth or Chatham, so that we might still calculate on 8 or 10 days' delay. The Bellerophon was too old for the voyage. She had not provisions enough. Moreover, the wind was contrary. When, therefore, we saw the ship returning up channel, our uncertainty and conjectures were renewed. Well, whatever these might be, everything was welcome when compared to the idea of transportation to St. Helena. Nevertheless, it occurred to us that in such a decisive moment, the emperor was bound to show a formal opposition to this violence. As to Napoleon himself, he attached but little importance to it, nor would he trouble himself about the matter. However, said we, it will be a weapon in the hands of our friends, and leave causes of remembrance, as well as grounds of defense with the public. I ventured, therefore, to read a paper I had prepared to His Majesty with the general sense of what he seemed pleased. After suppressing a few phrases and correcting others, it was signed and sent to Lord Keith. The following is a literal copy of this document. Protest. I hereby solemnly protest in the face of heaven and mankind against the violence that is done to me and the violation of my most sacred rights in forcibly disposing of my person and liberty. I voluntarily came on board the Bellerophon. I am not the prisoner. I am the guest of England. I came at the instigation of the captain himself, who said he had orders from the government to receive and convey me to England, together with my suite, if agreeable to me. I came forward with confidence to place myself under the protection of the laws of England. When once on board the Bellerophon, I was entitled to the hospitality of the British people. If the government, in giving the captain of the Bellerophon orders to receive me and my followers, only wished to lay a snare, it has forfeited its honor and disgraced its flag. If this act be consummated, it will be in vain for the English henceforth to talk of their sincerity, their laws, and liberties. British faith will have been lost in the hospitality of the Bellerophon. I appeal to history. It will say that an enemy who made war for 20 years against the English people came spontaneously in the hour of misfortune to seek an asylum under their laws. What more striking proof could he give of his esteem and confidence? But how did England reply to such an act of magnanimity? They pretended to hold out a hospitable hand to his enemy, and on giving himself up with confidence, he was immolated. Signed, Napoleon. Bellerophon at sea, Friday, August 4th, 1815. The Duc de Rovigo told me that the Emperor had demanded permission to send me to the Prince Regent at London, but that it was obstinately refused. The sea was rough, and the wind blew with violence. Most of us were affected with seasickness, but what cannot the preoccupation of the mind affect over physical infirmities? This was perhaps the only time in my life that I was not incommoded by such weather. On leaving Plymouth Sound, we stood to the eastward before the wind, but were soon after close hauled, tracking backwards and forwards, without being able to comprehend the cause of this new source of torment. 5th. The whole of this day was passed in the same manner. While conversing with the Emperor in the evening, he gave me 2 proofs of confidence, but I cannot now confide them to paper. 6th. We anchored about noon off Start Point, where there was no shelter whatever, though we had but a very short distance to go in order to anchor in Torbay. This circumstance excited great astonishment on our part. We had, however, heard that orders were given to meet the Northumberland. The departure of which vessel Portsmouth was urged with all possible haste. Accordingly, that ship soon appeared with 2 frigates full of troops which were to compose the garrison of St. Helena. These 3 ships anchored close to us, after which the communications amongst the whole squadron became very active. The precautions to prevent the approach of boats were still continued. Meanwhile, the mystery of our precipitate sailing from Plymouth and all the maneuvering that followed was discovered. Lord Keith had, we were told, received notice by telegraph that a public officer had just left London with a writ of habeas corpus to claim the person of the Emperor in the name of the laws or of some competent tribunal. We could neither ascertain the motives nor details of this circumstance. The admiral, it was added, had scarcely time enough to escape this difficulty. We heard that he was suddenly obliged to go on board a brig and quit Plymouth Sound. This was the motive which kept us out of Torbay. Admirals Keith and Cockburn came on board the Bellerophon. The flag of the latter was flying on board the Northumberland. They had a conference with the Emperor, to whom they delivered an extract from the instructions relative to our transportation to and stay at St. Helena. These stated that all our effects were to be examined for the purpose of taking away the money, bills, and diamonds belonging to the Emperor, as well as ourselves to be kept for us. We also heard that our arms would be taken from us at the same time, and that we were then to be transferred to the Northumberland. The documents were as follows. Order from Lord Keith to Captain Maitland of the Bellerophon. All arms of every description are to be taken from the French, of whatever rank, who are on board His Majesty's ship under your command. These arms will be carefully packed and are to remain in your charge so long as the persons to whom they belong continue on board the Bellerophon. They will then be under the charge of the captain of the ship to which the said individuals may be transferred. Instructions of ministers to Admiral Cockburn. When General Bonaparte leaves the Bellerophon to go on board the Northumberland, it will be the properest moment for Admiral Cockburn to have the effects examined which General Bonaparte may have brought with him. The Admiral will allow the baggage, the wines, an observation truly worthy of the English ministers, and provisions which the General may have brought with him, to be taken on board the Northumberland. Among the baggage, his table service shall be understood as included, unless it be so considerable as to seem rather an article to be converted into ready money than for real use. His money, his diamonds, and his saleable effects, consequently bills of exchange also, of whatever kind they may be, must be delivered up. The Admiral will declare to the General that the British government by no means intends to confiscate his property, but merely to take upon himself the administration of his effects, to hinder him from using them as a means to promote his escape. The examination shall be made in the presence of a person named by General Bonaparte. The inventory of the effects to be retained shall be signed by this person as well as by the Rear Admiral. or by the person whom he shall appoint to draw up the inventory, the interest or the principal according as his property is more or less considerable, shall be applied to his support. And in this respect, the principal arrangement is to be left to him. For this purpose, he can from time to time signify his wishes to the admiral till the arrival of the new governor of St. Helena, and afterwards to the latter. And if no objection is made to his proposal, the admiral or the governor can give the necessary orders, and the disbursement will be paid by bills on his majesty's treasury. In case of death, what foresight! He can dispose of his property by a last will, and may be assured that the contents of his testament shall be faithfully executed. As an attempt might be made to make part of his property pass for the property of the persons of his suite, it must be signified that the property of his attendants is subject to the same regulations. The admiral is not to take any person on board for St. Helena without the consent of such person, to whom he is previously to explain the necessity of being subjected to all the regulations which it may be thought proper to establish for securing the person of the general. It must be made known to the general that if he make any attempt to escape, he will expose himself to close imprisonment, and that any of his suite who may be discovered in endeavoring to facilitate his escape will incur the same punishment. Afterwards, the Act of Parliament made the latter offense death. All letters which shall be addressed to him or to any of his suite are to be delivered in the first place to the admiral or the governor, who is to read them previously to transmitting them. In the same regulation is to be observed with respect to the letters written by the general or those of his suite. The general is to be informed that the governor and the admiral have received positive orders to forward to his majesty's government any request or representation he may think proper to make. Nothing is left to their discretion on this point, but the paper on which such representation shall be written is to remain open in order that they may subjoin such observations as they may think expedient. It would not be easy to convey the intensity and nature of our feelings at this decisive moment in which outrage, violence, and injustice were accumulated on our heads. Constrained to reduce his suite to 3 persons, the emperor selected the Grand Marshal, M. de Montholon, and myself. Gourgaud, in despair at the idea of being left behind, entered into negotiation on the subject and succeeded. As the instructions only allowed Napoleon to take 3 officers, it was agreed that I should be considered purely in a civil capacity and to admit a 4th by the aid of this interpretation. 7th, the emperor addressed to Lord Keith a species of new protest against the violence done his person in forcibly removing him from the Bellerophon. I took it on board the Tonnant. Admiral Keith, a fine-looking old man of highly polished manners, received me with great politeness, but he carefully avoided touching on the subject of the protest, observing that he would give an answer in writing. This did not stop me. I stated the situation to Napoleon, who was very unwell, having his legs considerably swelled, and pointed out to his lordship how desirable it was for the emperor not to be sent off so suddenly. He replied that I had been a sailor and must therefore see the anchorage was unsafe, which was certainly true. I explained the emperor's repugnance to have his effects searched and tossed about, as proposed, assuring him that Napoleon would infinitely prefer seeing them thrown into the sea. The admiral answered that, as this was a positive order, he could not infringe on it. Finally, I demanded whether it was probable those appointed to search would go so far as to deprive the emperor of his sword. He said that it would be respected, but that Napoleon was the only person exempted, as all his followers would be disarmed. I assured him that I was already so, my sword having been taken from me before I left the Bellerophon. A secretary who was writing near us observed to Lord Keith in English that the orders stated that Napoleon himself was to be disarmed, upon which the admiral dryly replied, also in English, as well as I could comprehend, "Mind your own business, sir, and leave us to ours." Still continuing the conversation, I went over all that had occurred from the commencement. I had been the negotiator, I said, and ought therefore to feel most acutely, and had the greater right to be heard. Lord Keith listened to me with marked impatience. We were standing, and his frequent bows were evidently intended to make me retire. When I told him that Captain Maitland said he had been authorized to bring us to England without exciting a suspicion in our minds that we were to be prisoners of war, that the captain could not deny that we came on board voluntarily and in confidence, and that the letter of the Emperor to the Prince of Wales, which I had previously communicated to Captain Maitland, must necessarily have created tacit conditions, since he made no remarks on it. At length the admiral's ill humor and even anger broke forth, and he replied sharply that if such were the case, Captain Maitland must have been a fool, for his instructions contained nothing of the kind. And he was quite sure of this, for it was from himself that they had emanated. But, my lord, said I, permit me to observe in defense of Captain Maitland that your lordship speaks with a degree of severity for which you may become responsible for not only Captain Maitland, but Admiral Hotham and all the other officers whom we saw at the time conducted and expressed themselves in the same way towards us. Would it have been thus if their instructions had been so clear and positive? Saying this, I relieved the admiral of my presence. He made no attempt to prolong a subject which, perhaps his lordship's conscience rendered somewhat painful to him. Admiral Cockburn, aided by an officer of the customs, examined the effects of the Emperor. They seized 4,000 Napoleons and left 1,500 to pay the servants. This was all the Emperor's treasure. They were assisted, or rather impeded in the operation, by Marchand, the valet de chambre of His Majesty. This appeared to mortify the admiral excessively. Though requested to attend, not one amongst us would lend his presence to or witness an act which we regarded as being at once mean and insulting. Meanwhile, the moment of quitting the Bellerophon arrived, the Grand Marshal had been some time closeted with the Emperor, during which we remained in the outer cabin. On the door being opened, the Duc de Rovigo, bursting into tears, threw himself at the feet of the Emperor, kissing his hands. The Emperor, still calm and collected, embraced the Duke and continued his way towards the accommodation ladder, graciously saluting all those who happened to be on the quarter-deck. The whole of our party, whom we left behind, were in a state of the deepest anguish. Nor could I help observing to Lord Keith, who stood near me at the time, "You see, my lord, that the only persons who shed tears are those who remain." We reached the Northumberland between 1 and 2 o'clock. The Emperor remained on deck, conversing familiarly and cheerfully with those of the English who approached him. Lord Lothair and a Mr. Littleton had a long conversation with him on politics and government. I heard nothing of what passed. The Emperor seemed desirous that we should leave him to himself. I employed this moment of leisure in writing a last adieu to my wife and friends. Indeed, I felt very unwell and much fatigued. At the moment of getting under way, a cutter that was plying round the ship to keep off the people ran down a boat full of spectators close to us. Fatality seems to have brought them from a great distance to become the victims of this accident. I understood that there were 2 women amongst those who perished. Thus were we at length under sail for St. Helena, 13 days after our arrival at Plymouth, and 40 from our quitting Paris. Those of the attendants whom Napoleon was not allowed to take with him were the last to quit the ship, bearing with them mingled proofs of satisfaction and regret. Their departure gave rise to a second scene, not less affecting than the first. The Emperor retired to the cabin allotted to him about 7 o'clock. The English ministry warmly censured the respect which had been shown to the Emperor on board the Bellerophon, and issued fresh orders in consequence, so that a totally different style of manner and expression was affected in the Northumberland. The crew seemed to betray a ridiculous anxiety to be covered before the Emperor. It had been strictly enjoined to give him no other title than that of general, and only to treat him as such. This was the ingenious contrivance, that happy conception engendered by the diplomacy of the English ministers, and the title they thought proper to confer on him, whom they had recognized as first consul, whom they so often styled head of the French government, with whom they treated as emperor at Paris, when Lord Lauderdale was employed to negotiate and perhaps even sign articles at Chatillon. Hence, In a moment of warmth, the emperor, in allusion to this regulation, observed, "They may call me whatever they choose, but they cannot prevent me from being myself." It was in fact no less whimsical than ridiculous to see the ministers of England attach such importance to giving only the title of general to one who had governed so large a portion of Europe and made 7 or 8 kings, of whom several still retain this title of his creation, who had been above 10 years emperor of the French and had been anointed as well as consecrated in that quality by the head of the church, one who could boast 2 or 3 elections of the French people to the sovereignty, who had been acknowledged as emperor by the whole of continental Europe, had treated as such with all the sovereigns, concluding every species of alliance both of blood and interest with them, so that he united in his person every title, civil, political, and religious, existing among men, and which by a singular, though real consequence, not one of the reigning princes of Europe could have shown, accumulated in an equal degree on the chief and founder of his dynasty. Nevertheless, his majesty, who intended, had he landed in England, to assume the name and title of Colonel de Rock or Muro, no longer thought of it now that his legitimate titles were obstinately disputed. 8th through the 9th, the ship was in the greatest confusion and seemed to be quite encumbered with men as well as stores and luggage. We sailed in so great a hurry that there was scarcely anything on board in its place, so that the whole crew was now occupied in restoring order and preparing for the voyage. The following particulars will afford some idea of that part of the ship occupied by the emperor to suite. The space abaft the mizzen-mast contained 2 public and 2 private cabins. The first was a dining room about 10 feet broad and extending the whole width of the ship, lighted by a porthole at each end and a skylight above. The drawing room was composed of all the remaining space, diminished by 2 symmetrical cabins on the right and left, each having an entry from the dining room, mess room, and another from the drawing room. The emperor occupied that on the left, in which his camp bedstead had been put up. That on the right was appropriated to the admiral. It was above all peremptorily enjoined that the drawing room should be in common and not given up to the emperor. To such a ridiculous extent had the fears and solicitude of the ministry been carried. The form of the dining table resembled that of the mess room. The emperor sat with his back to the drawing room and after cabin, and looking towards the head of the ship. On his left sat Madame Bertrand, and on his right the admiral. On the right of the admiral sat Madame de Montalon. These filled one side of the table. At the end next that lady was Captain Ross, who commanded the ship, opposite whom at the corresponding end sat Monsieur de Montalon by Madame Bertrand, next to him the admiral's secretary. The remaining space was the side of the table opposite the emperor, which, beginning from Captain Ross, was occupied by Grand Marshal, the general commanding the 53rd Regiment, myself, and Baron Gorgau. The admiral invited 1 or 2 of the officers every day who were intermixed among us at table. I generally sat almost opposite the emperor. The band of the 53rd, which had been recently formed, exercised during dinner at the expense of our ears. We had 2 courses, but there was a want of provisions. Our tastes were besides very different from those of our hosts. It is true they did their utmost, but after all, it would not do to be difficult. I was lodged with my son on the starboard side, even with the mainmast in a small cabin enclosed with canvases and having a gun in it. We made as much sail as the wind would permit to get out of the channel, and stood along the coast of England, communicating with all the ports in order to procure additional supplies of sea stock and complete the stores of the ship. A large quantity of articles was brought to us from Plymouth, off which port we were joined by several other vessels, as well as from Falmouth. The 10th. This day we cleared the channel and lost sight of land. We had now entered upon the dreary, unknown course to which fate had doomed us. Again, my agonies were renewed. Again, the dear connections I had abandoned resumed their influence over my heart. I indulged in the luxuriance of grief and found a miserable satisfaction in its excess. Objects of all my affections, I exclaimed, friends of my heart, for whom alone I live, reflected I am proving myself worthy of you. Let that thought support you also, and oh, forget me not. Meanwhile, we advanced in our course, and were soon to be out of Europe. Thus, in less than 6 weeks, had the emperor abdicated his throne and placed himself in the hands of the English, who were now hurrying him to a barren rock in the midst of a vast ocean. This is certainly no ordinary instance of the chances of fortune, and no common trial of the firmness of the mind. Yet will posterity be better able to judge of these 3 leading circumstances than we of the present day. They will have to pronounce on a clear horizon, whereas we are enveloped in clouds. Scarcely had Napoleon descended from his throne when those who witnessed the misfortunes of the nation which followed regarded his sacrifice as a capital error. When they heard of his being a prisoner at Plymouth, they censured his magnanimity. There was not a single incident, even his suffering himself to be sent to St. Helena, which they did not make a subject of reproach. But such is the tendency of vulgar minds, never judging except on what they see at the moment. It is, however, impossible to judge of one resolution without considering not only the evils which unavoidably attend it, but those which a contrary determination might have produced. By abdicating, Napoleon rallied all the friends of their country round one point, that of its safety. He left France demanding before all nations nothing but the sacred rights of national independence. He took from the Allies every pretext to ravage and dismember our territory. He destroyed all idea of his personal ambition, terminating his career as a martyr of a cause of which he had been the hero. If all the advantages which might have been derived from his genius and talents as a citizen were not obtained, it is to be imputed to the weakness and treachery of the transitory government by which he was succeeded. When he arrived at Rochefort and the commander of the frigates refused to sail, ought he too have abandoned the fruits of his abdication? Should he have returned to the interior and placed himself at the head of mere bands when he had renounced armies? Or ought he to have desperately encouraged a civil war which would lead to no beneficial result, but only to serve to ruin the remaining pillars, the future hope of the country? In this state of affairs, he formed a most magnanimous resolution, worthy of his life, and a complete refutation of the calumnies that for 20 years have been so ridiculously accumulated on his head. But what will history say of those ministers of a liberal nation, the guardians and depositaries of popular rights, ever ardent in encouraging a Coriolanus, having only chains for a Camillus? As to the reproach of suffering himself to be transported to St. Helena, it would be disgrace to answer such a charge. To contend with an adversary in the cabin of a ship, kill someone with his own hand, or attempt to set fire to the powder magazine would have been at best the act of a buccaneer. Dignity and misfortune, submission to necessity, have their glory. It is that which becomes great men, overwhelmed by adversity. When the English ministers found themselves in possession of Napoleon's purse and passion had much more influence over them than justice or policy, they neglected the triumph of their laws, denied the rights of hospitality, disregarded their own honor, and compromised that of their own country. They determined to exile their guest in the midst of the ocean, to keep him prisoner on a rock 2,000 leagues from Europe and far from all communication with mankind. It seemed that they wished to trust to the anguish of exile, the fatigues of a long voyage, privations of every kind, and the corroding influence of a burning climate for effecting that which they feared to perform themselves. In order, however, to gain over the public voice, to make it appear that their conduct was indispensably necessary, the newspapers were instigated to irritate the passions of the multitude by reviving former calumnies and falsehoods, while the ministers on their side represented their own determination as an engagement entered into with their allies. We presented ourselves at the moment of popular effervescence, just as everything which could render us odious had been brought forward. The public journals were full of the most virulent declamations, maliciously raking up every act and expression of the previous struggle of 20 years that could wound the national pride or rekindle its hatred. Yet, when all England hurried to the south to see us, during our state Plymouth, the conduct and sentiments of the multitudes who came were enough to convince us that this factitious irritation would disappear of itself. Hence, we were led to hope on our departure that the British people would daily grow more impartial in a cause to which they were no longer parties, and that the current of public opinion would eventually turn against the ministers, and that we had thus ensured them formidable attacks and a terrible responsibility for a future day. Under these circumstances, what could these ministers have replied had any member of Parliament risen and made use of the following argument? We have just been favored by an unexampled instance of success. Fortune has caused our most constant and implacable enemy to surrender at discretion. We have suddenly found ourselves masters of the fate of the French sovereign and people. It was in our power to dispose of the future, or at least to enchain its unfavorable chances for a long period. Have our ministers profited by so many advantages? Have they ensured our interests, happiness, and glory? Have they guaranteed a durable peace, the first of our wishes, the most pressing of our wants? Have they extinguished that turbulent agitation, that warlike disposition throughout Europe, which keeps every nation in arms? Have they secured that happy political equilibrium which prevents revolutions and reduces wars to a mere trifle? Have they strengthened and propagated our national principles? Have they secured for us the respect and affection of the European family as the price of our efforts in its favor? Have they proved the excellence and superiority of our institutions and laws? Alas! I hear only negative to all these questions. Europe was never more inflamed. Its situation is at best only an armed truce. Each power increases the number of its soldiers. The political balance is totally destroyed and broken. In a neighboring state, we have annihilated the very principles which form the sacred basis of our own political theory. Universal jealousy animates the whole continent against us, and our civil laws have sustained an outrage calculated to leave an indelible stain on the nation. Do our ministers flatter themselves that the destruction of our rival is a sufficient answer to every charge? But how are we so deeply interested in her destruction? In sound policy, is not her existence necessary to our glory and stability? For I am one of those who fear our own excesses. Should we remain uncontrolled in the midst of prosperity, what do I say? This very rival may be essentially necessary to us, either as an ally or counterpoise. It would be the height of folly to imagine that the great struggle being over, the continental states will not again give way to their natural jealousy of our maritime power, so prejudicial to their interests. In sincerely uniting themselves to us, they merely warded off the most pressing danger. New disputes and difficulties must infallibly arise, and if that system of universal monarchy which has so often endangered us, and which we overturned when it extended from the south towards the north, should menace us again by coming from the north towards the south, where would be our resource? How blind, then, is our policy to annihilate France by imposing on her a government that our armies are obliged to defend and preserve? Above all, why have we drawn the personal animosity of her immense population on ourselves? If the weakening or even destruction of France had been our real interest, it ought to have been effected. Though justice might have censured the step, policy would have excused it, but it should have been frankly avowed. Nations as well as individuals know how to submit to necessity. When the vanquished are plainly told that the rights of victory are exercised over them, their pride is soothed by reflecting on the vicissitudes of fortune. But their hearts are filled with bitterness and rage if they are plundered under the mask of hypocrisy and bad faith. This is to add outrage to violence. Why therefore say that you only seek the happiness of France, while you load her with contributions? Why pretend to have no other object in view but her deliverance from tyranny, and yet inflict intolerable sufferings on her? Why profess to have only made war against a single man, and yet trample on the whole nation? Why seize her fortresses and strip her of the trophies of her victories? Not because she had been vanquished in her turn, which would have been natural and just, but under the pretense that these possessions were only the result of robbery and plunder. Why so much contradiction between words and actions? Because the real object of these proceedings is one which those who aim at it dare not avow. Because the doctrine which guides them is too unpopular to be acknowledged. Because they endeavor to serve a party in Europe rather than eternal principles. Far be it from me to make any personal application. I wish to avoid passion and prejudice. I consider no other interest at this moment but that of my country. May our ministers entertain the same sentiments. But how came they to place England amongst or at the head of powers who have shamelessly and in the face of Europe violated the sacred rights of national independence? How could they dare to sanction such doctrines? In their stay at the Congress of Vienna, did they intoxicate themselves over the cup of the old continental doctrines? Or did the arrival of the sovereigns in this country inoculate them with sentiments of absolute power, destroying the national maxim of the people's rights? What can have led to overturn the solemn choice of a nation? Napoleon on his return had consecrated the very same public institutions and fundamental laws which we ourselves boast. All his strength and popularity arose from these acts. Had he afterwards infringed on them, both would have been lost. He was too wise and too strong to be suspected of such a design. The institutions of both nations would therefore have corresponded with each other, in spite of all obstacles. Perhaps this might have been the prelude to a new and unknown system, when the people of two countries which had till now only felt repugnance and hatred against each other might have thenceforth formed a natural union with common and inseparable interests. Instead of this, narrow and unjust views have thrown us into a position altogether forced and unnatural. Great Britain appears to stand in direct opposition to her manners, religion, constitution, and laws. We, a free people, impose chains on our neighbors. We, a sovereign people, must destroy the sovereignty of the people next to us. We, the guardians of liberal ideas, employ our armies to extinguish those very ideas. We, the protectors and head of the Protestant faith, permit the massacre of our brethren in France and in sight of our national banners. Let not the ministers take credit to themselves for maintaining by this system a large army on the continent, which will cost us nothing. I dread such an advantage much more than some reverses. In a foreign land, our soldiers will become foreigners. They will at last have no other country than the field of battle. The manners and principles of our youth will become corrupted amidst the principle and manners of other nations. If ministers, the guardians of our Constitution, had inherited the spirit of our forefathers instead of thinking it important to preserve a large army, they would rather have been eager to reduce it. Will ministers justify themselves on the plea that the Allies wished once for all utterly to destroy the revolutionary principle, but the revolution had ended and has been recommenced by the Allies themselves? The sovereigns, by insisting on prerogatives and favoring the aristocratical faction to excess, have again awakened the jealousy and aroused the passions of the people. Europe will soon be divided throughout into the two extreme parties of Marius and Sylla. The cause of kings and their courts had been gained. They have hazarded it once more. Whither may not this lead to us? There is no nation in Europe that suffers so much from the French Revolution as France. Will that unhappy country be destined to become a spectacle of the contrary excesses? I must notice a vulgar error propagated by our late measures. The very man who is now charged with all the crimes of the Revolution is he who miraculously stopped it in its course, with the energy and force of an athletic champion, stopping a chariot in the midst of its rapid career. It was he who replaced France in the European community, who reestablished the manners, principles, and language of modern civilization. It was he who removed the stains of that very revolution by actions. The most brilliant and glorious. On entering France, the Allies could not help but doing homage to his monuments, institutions, and administration the most vigorous and enlightened hitherto known. What would have become of the sovereigns of Vienna and Berlin if on entering their capitals he had revolutionized their subjects? It is well known that he rather kept down the germs of commotion found in these states, so much so indeed that the revolutionists of the day considered him as an apostate from the revolution. How does it happen that circumstances and our injudicious conduct now point him out as its martyr and messiah to these very people? It was proper to make war against him when he was formidable to us, but we should have coalesced with his genius the moment of our first object was attained. Let ministers, therefore, no longer attempt to justify their conduct and measures by telling us that we were implicitly prescribed by the grand principle of legitimacy. What can they possibly mean by that? It is the absolute prohibition of every new dynasty, whatever. Can there be men ignorant of the fact that this principle, however true in theory, is only decided by facts in the political world? Do they not know that crowns are in the hands of God and in the winning of battles? If that of Waterloo had taken a different turn, what would have become of this famous principle? Would they have refused to treat sine qua non? And do they really and sincerely expect to make us believe that Europe could no longer exist or a new dynasty to appear? Dare they maintain that the welfare of nations depends upon a religious belief that the favor of heaven has been entirely exhausted on the reigning families of the present day? But how long has this been the creed of our ministers? How is it that they have become so difficult and scrupulous on this principle? Have their various communications and secret understandings with Vienna not only established a coalition of kings, but also a coalition of doctrines and ministers, a conspiracy against fortune and the irresistible force of events? We must then have been much less scrupulous when we acknowledged the first consul and received his ambassadors, or when, at a later period and while at war with him, we recognized him as the head of the French government, when we sent Lord Lauderdale to Paris for the purpose of treating with the Emperor of the French, when these very ministers treated on the same footing at Châtillon, and perhaps even signed articles. If these had been ratified, what would then have become the sanctity of the new principle? Why are they at this moment so indifferent to the events of Spain, where a son has dethroned his father? How do they happen to be the allies of Sweden, whence the legitimate sovereign has been exiled, to call it a foreigner? But what is still more extraordinary, how durst they adopt this new doctrine without thinking of the family which governs us, of the glorious revolution which placed it upon the throne, of the excellent laws by which its sway has been distinguished, and which have ruled us with so much glory to the present time? But enough has been said of the errors of our ministers abroad. I turn to an act of their domestic policy which outrages our laws and wounds our honor. I allude to the transportation of Napoleon, this noble adversity by an act of magnanimity worthy of his life, disdaining to address himself to the Emperor of Russia, who had called himself his friend, disdaining to apply to the Emperor of Austria, whose son-in-law he was, selected an asylum on our island in the bosom of a nation against which he had fought for 20 years, because persecuted by all the sovereigns of Europe, he still wished in all his misfortunes to preserve his independence, and thought to find it in the stability and empire of our laws. What nobler triumph could England have? What greater homage can be paid to our institutions? Our ministers laid a snare for him. They encouraged his sentiments, and when he placed himself in their power, they loaded him with chains. For it is a fact which no person can deny that Napoleon came on board the Bellerophon freely and of his own accord. He was told that orders had been given to the captain to receive and conduct them to England. These assurances were taken by him as an engagement of hospitality. His letter to the Prince Regent is proof of this, and that engagement ought to have been valid for him when the letter, which was communicated before he himself appeared, passed without any observation being made on it. It is in vain for ministers to answer that they were forced to deliver him up to the ostracism of kings, and that they had engaged to do so. The answer leaves them in the following shameful dilemma. Either they made the engagement before his arrival and by enticing him forfeited their honor, or it was made after his coming and therefore they betrayed their duty in subjecting our laws and our dignity to foreign councils. I demand therefore that Napoleon be brought back and that he be landed in this country which he had chosen as an asylum. I demand this as a solemn reparation for the outrage offered to our laws, which by this triumph will become the more renowned from their momentary violation. The 11th through the 14th, our course was shaped to cross the Bay of Biscay and double Cape Finisterre. The wind was fair, though light, and the heat excessive. Nothing could be more monotonous than the time we now passed. The Emperor breakfasted in his own cabinet at irregular hours. We took our breakfast at 10 o'clock in the French style, while the English continued to breakfast in their own way at 8. The Emperor sent for one of us every morning to know what was going on, the distance run, the state of the wind, and other particulars connected with our progress. He read much, dressed towards 4 o'clock, and then came into the general cabin. Here he played a chess with one of the party. At 5 o'clock, the Admiral, having come out of his cabin a few minutes before, announced that dinner was on the table. It is well known that Napoleon was scarcely ever more than 15 minutes at his dinner. Here the two courses alone occupied from an hour to an hour and a half. This was to him a most serious annoyance, though he never mentioned it. His features, gestures, and manner always evinced perfect indifference. Neither the new system of cookery, the difference or quality of the dishes, ever met with his censure or approbation. He never expressed any wish or objection on the subject. He was attended by his 2 valets, who stood behind his chair. At first, the Admiral was in the habit of offering to help the Emperor, but the acknowledgment of Napoleon was expressed so coldly that this practice was discontinued. The Admiral continued very attentive, but thenceforth only pointed out to the servants what was preferable. They alone attended to these matters, to which the Emperor seemed totally indifferent, neither seeing, noticing, or seeing anything. He was generally silent, remaining in the midst of conversation as if totally unacquainted with the language, though it was French. If he spoke, it was to ask some technical or scientific question and to address a few words to those whom the Admiral occasionally asked to dinner. I was the person to whom the Emperor generally addressed his questions in order to translate them. I need scarcely to observe that the English are accustomed to remain a long time at table after dessert, drinking and conversing. The Emperor, already tired by the tedious dinner, could never have endured this custom, and he rose. Therefore, from the first day immediately after coffee had been handed round, and went on deck, followed by the Grand Marshal and myself. Disconcerted the Admiral, who took occasion to express his surprise to his officers. But Madame Bertrand, whose maternal language is English, warmly replied, "Do not forget, Admiral, that your guest is a man who has governed a large portion of the world, and that kings once contended for the honor of being admitted to his table." "Very true," rejoined the Admiral, "and this officer, who possesses good sense, a becoming pliability of manners, and sometimes much elegance, did his utmost from that moment to accommodate the Emperor in his habits. He shortened the time of sitting at table, ordering coffee for Napoleon and those who accompanied him, even before the rest of the company had finished their dinner. The moment Napoleon had taken his coffee, he left the cabin, upon which everybody rose till he had quitted their room, and then continued to take their wine for another hour. The Emperor remained walking on deck till dark, attended by the Grand Marshal and myself. This became a regular practice, and was seldom omitted. On returning to the after cabin, he sat down to play 21 with us, and generally retired in about half an hour. The 15th, we asked permission to be admitted into the Emperor's presence this morning, and all entered his cabin at the same time. He was not aware of the cause of this visit. It was his birthday, which seemed to have altogether escaped his recollection. We had been in the habit of seeing him on that anniversary, on a much larger stage, and in the midst of his power, but never were our vows more sincere, or our hearts more full of attachment than on the present occasion. The days now exactly resembled each other. At night we constantly played at 21. The admiral and some of his officers being occasionally of the party, the emperor used to retire after losing, according to custom, his 10 or 12 Napoleons. This happened to him daily because he would persist in leaving his stake on the table until it had produced a considerable number. Today he had gained from 80 to 100. The admiral dealt the cards. The emperor still wished to leave his winnings in order to see how far he could reach, but thought he could perceive it would be as agreeable to the admiral if he stopped where he was. The emperor had won 16 times and might have won more than 60,000 Napoleons, while all present were expatiating on his being thus singularly favored by fortune. An English officer observed that it was the anniversary of his birthday, the 16th through 21st. We doubled Cape Finisterre on the 16th, passed Cape St. Vincent on the 18th, and were opposite the Straits of Gibraltar next day, continuing our course along the coast of Africa towards Madeira. Nothing worthy of remark occurred, there being a perfect uniformity in our habits and mode of passing the time. If there was any difference, it could only arise from the subject of our conversation.